Hi, I'm Joshua Farnsworth, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make this collapsible Viking camp chair, and it only takes under an hour. So I was camping on the property of my friends, the Ellis brothers, and I saw this really cool camp chair that they had sitting there up their property. And I sat in it and I was amazed. Not only is it collapsible and it comes apart, but it was incredibly comfortable. And I saw that it was only one joint, one mortise and tenon joint. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make this particular bench. It should only take you under an hour. And the great news is this is not precision work. This is kind of rough work. So almost anybody can do this project. And I should have some free plans that you can get. I'll put the link below this video along with all the tools that I used to make this, which is not a big list of tools. So here we go. Let's make this Viking camp chair. I start by measuring out where I want to cut the two parts out of my 8-foot board. By the way, I'm using 2x12 pressure treated lumber so the chair will last longer outdoors. But you can use an untreated board if you plan on keeping this out of the rain. If you're using treated lumber, just make sure to wipe your tools down afterwards with oil to prevent rust. I'm laying these two pieces out in a way that I can leave out the major knots, but it's not a big deal if you have knots on the boards. Because this isn't nicely squared up lumber, and because the joint doesn't have to fit incredibly perfect, I can get by with using a framing square to lay out almost everything. You can use a crosscut handsaw, but I had my sliding miter saw out, so I used it to make these cuts. Again, these cuts don't need to be perfect, so just get your cut pretty close to square across the board. And make sure you let your blade come to a full stop before you move anything around. I recently saw someone on Instagram who had badly cut her hand because she was being rushed in this exact situation. Now that my two pieces are cut, I'll lay out the tenon board first. I measure down for the seat length. Then I draw a square line across the board and then measure in for the tenon from each side. This isn't a critical measurement as long as you come in the same amount from both sides. Then I set a combination square at the mark that I set. Then I run the square and pencil along the board to extend the layout line for the tenon. This is an important step if you'll be using a handsaw to rip down the line. If you're using a bandsaw, then you really only need to make the marks at the end of the board, or just set the bandsaw to the right measurement. And I always keep a habit of marking my waist, even though it would be pretty hard to mess this cut up. I've darkened my lines with a marker here so you can see how the seat is supposed to look. If you've got a bandsaw, this ripping step only takes a few seconds. If you'll be using a rip handsaw, then obviously you'll be getting a much better exercise than me. Once the first cut is made, all I have to do is flip the board over and the fence will give me the exact same measurement in from the edge. For the crosscuts on the seat, I find it faster to use a crosscut handsaw than trying to use power tools. Now I lay out the mortise on the seat back. I make a small tick mark where I want the mortise to start. Then I lay the tenon on the board to get the width of the mortise. I make another tick mark. Then I square the framing square up against the edge of the board and carry both of these lines across the face of the board. Now I take the combination square measurement that I used for marking the tenon, and I use it to mark the ends of the mortise. I set the tenon over the mortise and draw the lines. Now I've got my mortise laid out. I use a square to continue the mortise layout lines over the edges of the board, and then I extend them on the other face of the board. I then use a straight edge to connect the layout lines. If your board is relatively square, then the layout lines should meet like they do here. But like I said before, this joint doesn't need to fit really tightly, so don't stress out if your lines don't line up perfectly. And I again use the combination square to mark the edges of the mortise. Now it's time to establish cut lines around the mortise. First, I use a Holdfast to hold the board down to my workbench. Then I use a large chisel to outline the mortise. I'm not hitting the chisel hard yet because I'm just trying to keep a clean mortise. And notice that I'm putting the bevel edge of the chisel toward the waist. This ensures that the walls of my mortise will be straight and clean because of the flat surface of the chisel. I always chop across the grain first and extend a hair past the edge of the mortise. This helps to prevent splitting when I use the chisel on the edges of the mortise, which, as you can see, run with the grain. I flip the board over and I repeat. Here's a close-up view. To remove the majority of the mortise waste, you can either use an auger bit and brace, or a drill press with a Forstner bit. Forstner bits on a drill press are my favorite way to clean out a large mortise, especially when I'm building workbenches that have a ton of these mortises. I use as large a bit as I can without getting too close to my layout lines. The chisel marks that I made on the layout lines help to prevent the wood from chipping out. I try to get the holes to overlap a bit to make waste removal easier. And notice how I drew a center line to aid in getting the bit centered in the mortise. I strop my chisel before going back to chop the mortise. I try to strop every couple of minutes of working so that I don't have to go back to the honing stones. This is a really great time saver, and it keeps me working with a razor sharp chisel. Then I remove waste from the mortise, but I don't get too close to the line yet, and I don't chop all the way to the bottom. I don't want to risk blowing out beyond the mortise lines on the other side. And I usually have to work the chisel at an angle to get the waste out of the corners. Once I've gotten really close to all the layout lines, then I can finally drop my chisel in the knife lines. This method will ensure that my mortise walls stay crisp and don't get pushed backwards with the pressure of too much wood. Once the first side is complete, I flip the board over and repeat the process again, meeting in the center of the board. Without using my joiner's mallet, I use my chisel to pare away any remaining gunk. I like to use a cabinet maker's rasp to bevel the edges of the tenon. This will help the tenon slide into the mortise easier and will also keep it from splitting when it's set on the ground. Now I check the fit of the tenon in the mortise. It appears to fit, but more snugly than I want for this chair. If yours fits too tight, you can either use a rasp to expand the mortise a bit, or widen the mortise a little bit more with a chisel. This is a nice, fairly loose fit that I'm going for. And this is what the chair will look like when you're finished.
As an optional final step, I like to use the rasp to ease the edges anywhere it might be uncomfortable when sitting. You just don't want a sharp corner digging into your skin. That's it. Wasn't that pretty simple? This is a super easy project to work on while you're quarantined during this coronavirus pandemic. And hopefully it'll help you get outside and enjoy the sun. Away from people, of course. My sweet wife was kind enough to offer a demonstration of how easy this Viking chair is to set up. And she'd really like you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.
This is Joshua Farnsworth. If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. You can ask questions and share your projects with thousands of woodworkers on my forum.